So maybe to frame a little bit the discussion, Roger, I think when we first spoke about these little events, you had some very interesting consideration over oxygenation and residual activities. If you want to refresh our mind on how different type of oxidation could be occurring after harvest, it could be nice to hear from you. But if you want to start otherwise, I see, Daniel, you want...
He handed me the mic.
Okay, so Roger, maybe I think it would be good to have some refresher.
So, firstly, just let me say how rewarding it is to come to an event and see so many friends and people. And it touched me this morning when I walked in. I really mean it, and it's a pleasure to be here. So back to the question. 2011 was a high incidence of botrytis, high incidence of lacase activity. And the concern with lacase is twofold. One, it's much more active than normal phenol oxidase in the consumption of oxygen in juice and in wine. It's not inhibited by SO2, so it's going to keep oxidising phenolic compounds, monomerics, in the presence of SO2. And it actually has residual activity in finished wines. So even though PPO doesn't have any activity in finished wine, lacase does. So if you had botrytis, it doesn't follow that you have lacase, but you need to have botrytis as a prerequisite in order to have lacase. Okay, so it's not a correlation, it's a pre-existing condition or an essential prerequisite to get into that box. And 2011, in many vineyards, was grapes that were in that box. Is that clear? The second factor is, and the concern was that at the time, a number of wineries were sending out samples to get an assay for lacase activity. And some of those assay numbers were coming back 0, meaning not detectable. And yet people had samples which were turning brown quickly. Okay, so there was a problem with the assay and the interpretation. And I'll come back to it later, but the only question is 5 years later, are we any better off? And you can help me answer that one. But I don't think we learned from 2011 in that regard. What does that really mean? It means that of those berries that were higher in lacase, they would have had more destruction of the monomerics. And lacase will use anthocyanin as a substrate. So what you see in lacase-infected red wines is loss of anthocyanin colour, which won't be around to form polymeric pigment, and rapid oxygen uptake. And if you were in a mode of aerations and a micro-ox regime, this would actually be disastrous. And that was part of the comment, I think, in 2011. The question was, which tank has lacase activity? And if your assay lets you down, you can understand there was some letdown. So back to, I was struck by the conditions now. Remember Greg's comment about cool northern Atlantic from ice melt. Looking at cooler onset to winter, similar to 2011, not as hot. Not as hot in some areas means more humid. One of the onset conditions for botrytis is humidity, not just temperature. As the temperature goes up, we actually dry out. We actually become less pressure from botrytis. So I suppose as an old man speaking to young people, how many of you are Shakespearean? Well, anyway, in Julius Caesar, this croaky old guy called Artemidorus comes up to Julius and says, Caevae Ides Martia, which means beware the Ides of March, which means watch out for March 15th. Okay? No relevance, don't quote me. But a friend of mine might have said to you, go out in your vineyard on March 15th and have a bloody look, because you would be looking for onset of botrytis spores and you would be trying to understand ahead of time whether you should do something about that. Maybe a few other days, but we'll pick March 15th because that's what Shakespeare said. But those of you that have Julian calendars, never mind. We have Julian days. You missed the pun. You understand why we have Julian days is because he was born in a... Never mind, that's a C-section. No. Forget Caesarean, understand Julian days, and understand it's Julius Caesar, and understand it's Julian calendars. And so if we go Julian days, the only comment I would make is, in the Julius Caesar world, it depends which day you were born. So we can do degree day calculations and summations, but it really depends on flowering and set. Okay? So remember your birthday, not when you finished high school. High school and college is a wonderful set of numbers, and those are called degree days that we look at in sugar and mapling. But you might want to remember the day you were born. So one of the seasonal patterns when you're comparing seasons is go back and look at bud break or flowering and set. Because if you don't have those numbers, you can often be a week or two off, and you'll attribute it to other things, and in fact, it's due to something else. So part of our concerns in correlation are what were the birth dates, what were the set dates of 2011, 2016, what's the date of set in your vineyard this year? And if you don't have those numbers, you might want to collect them, but try to think in those terms of when did the clock start, not just what was the temperature in the room in the second week of July. That's true, but it might have been preset. The biggest factor is if you looked at berry size, most of us would have to do those measurements. So 20% berry weight is by volume, okay? The diameter would be cubed to give you the volume. So you would have to have something like 2.5 times, 2.5% change in the diameter would give you about a 20% change in berry weight. 2.5%. You and I can't see that, so don't kid yourself. So these berries would look almost identical until you do berry weight calculations. 20% more in berry weight, now go back and look at all the measures and divide them by 20% less, and now is it a dilution factor or it was a metabolism factor? So what we would normally try to do is work out sugar per berry, tannin per berry, anthocyanin per berry, because that may not have changed in these seasons. It's all a function of the initial conditions that caused the berry size to be different, and that led to a different composition. So I don't know the answer. Hopefully that's going to set up the questions and a bit of discussion, but I have a concern about laccase. All I'll go back and say, did we learn from 2011? And if this was a season like that, would you be ready for it?
I think we all need a little more Roger in our lives. So that was awesome. Thank you for that. And Thibaut, to get to your question about was there aroma degradation with the 11 picking at a later degree day? And I think Roger, thinking about it, I didn't see that in my wines, and going back and drinking 11s versus other vintages, and especially 16. 16's too young to tell. The wines are babies, but I don't remember, and I don't think of 11 as a low aromatic here. I think the wines are kind of pensive, and they reflect this like dark, beautiful season with a really crazy ending. But I don't think that they're low aromatics. And I think Roger nailed the reason is the birth date. You know, that vintage was so cool. It was 2011. It was even a week delayed behind 2010, which is so, one of the coolest seasons that we saw. And so I don't see that as a hallmark of the vintage. And I think it's probably what Roger said. It's the birth date of the season, of that growing season. So.
So I'm going to follow Roger's lead. Lovely to have you here, Roger, and be a little bit of a philosopher here. First of all, Thibaut, thank you for putting together this day, and my mind is kind of reeling with so many different aspects of it. You referred a couple times to a winemaker's vintage, and I think we may have a different interpretation of that. I remember talking to Paul Pontellier, I think it was in '87, who we sadly lost this year. And I was calling him to commiserate about a wet, rainy vintage in Bordeaux. And he said, no, Daniel, it's a winemaker's vintage. This is the vintage where we make a difference. So 2011 was a vintage where we made a difference, where the winemaker really had to work and contribute to make a quality wine. It's also a year where I think the practice, which wasn't so common when I started in this business, of doing internships and working around the world really informed people. And I think with the climate variation that we're seeing and the amount of extremes, if you think about the vintages from 2009 to 2016, what we've seen, the two cool vintages in 10 and 11, the kind of normal vintages, God bless, in 12 and 13, and the earliest vintages we've ever seen in 14 and 15, we've got these extremes coming at us. And I think working around the world informs us and helps us cope with these challenges. And that brings me to the cogent point here, is that we've been big supporters of Fruition, and we use their technology, but nothing replaces being out in the vineyard and paying attention and being an observer and using all your years of experience to figure out how to behave, how to act, what to do. 2011 was a great example of that. And it's also an example, looking back 5 years later, of saying, you know, Thibaut said, well, did you pick later in the growing degree days? Well, I could answer that question if we were paying as much attention then as we are now, because we keep evolving. And now we look at sugar loading curves relative to growing degree days. I don't think we were doing that so much in 2011. Were the aromatics less? I would say there were less stellar wines in our cellar. And for that reason, we made a very severe selection. And we have our 2011 out here. You can taste and be the judge. But to achieve what we did, it took two things: not trying to make a 2012 and 2011, but accepting what nature offered us, and making a very severe selection of what we had in the cellar. I looked at our color analysis, and I really can't say that I see much difference in what we did. Was we analyzed bottled wine, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13. We looked through all of those, and there really wasn't anything that stuck out in 2011. I think you asked about barrel regime. So we used less new oak in 2011. I think that the talk about oxidation bears that out. It was not a vintage that could support that much new oak, so we dialed back on the oak. Was there another question, Thibaut? Is that pretty much covered?
No, I mean, it's a free talk.
Yeah. So I'm trying to follow the program here, but I think that pretty well summarizes. I think field truthing, being out there, and the berry sensory, if any of you are using berry sensory analysis, having a protocol for tasting berries, logging your results. And I think we really picked, in 2011, I was looking at my notes, on the basis of IBMP degradation and skin softness. And that gave us the wines that we got.
So, Mark, you're an expert of tasting wine with people. So what do the consumer of the wine eventually say about 2011?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm going to preface this by saying it's interesting being the only non-technical presenter at a thoroughly technical conference. Unfortunately, this is something there's no real technical answer. But I was thinking, how do you answer the question, how consumers perceive 2011? First of all, there are many different categories of consumer and many different responses to the vintage. I would have to first thing I'll say is I tend to look at the positive and find the beauty where it's there. And I think there were some really lovely wines made in 2011. I think one of the challenges with 2011 was that we've done a pretty good job, and I think rightly so, in sort of training the consumer that they don't need to worry that much about Napa Valley vintages or about California vintages. There's a baseline of consistency, of quality, even when there's a diversity of character between vintages. And I think you probably noticed I'm not from Napa originally, but I've worked here for 21 years. And I think 2011 was the first vintage where consumers maybe lost their trust in just pulling a bottle off the shelf, because although there were some beautiful wines, there were some wines that it was less easy to enjoy, and you had to know which you were getting. I would say that having said that, overall, I don't think the general consumer base lost their faith in California wines as much as we might have feared they did. I think a lot of people it sort of slid by. I will say that when I was asked to talk about the 2011 vintage, it wouldn't be untrue to say I was thinking about it and thinking, it's kind of a relief that I haven't had to talk about 2011 for quite a long time. It was the first vintage where we found ourselves almost having to be on the defensive about our wines and point out the positive aspects when they were there, or point out that these wines were the successes in a maybe less predictable vintage. However, something I thought I would point out is that there's a sort of undercurrent of critics. I think the big critics didn't like 2011. The big scoring publications, not favorable in general to 2011 across the board. But combination of 2010 and 2011, I would say if we were to learn something, and I get to travel around the world as well, not just around this country, and there were lots of places where people were appreciating not only 2010, but also 2011, the good wines, and saying, wow, Napa Valley can still make beautiful wines that are not relying solely on super ripe, super rich, very heavy flavor profiles. Mm-hmm. And it was a vintage that revealed to people that you can make great wines with delicacy, with freshness. I might be totally imagining this and making it up, but one thing that some people would say is, if you cast your minds back nearly 20 years or maybe soon after that, some people said that 97 was a vintage that changed the sort of general trend in California and Napa. And when people saw the success and the popularity of some of the big wines in 97, they tried to push that in each vintage and push that further. And I slightly wonder, some of the vintages since 2010 and 2011, whether more and more winemakers are realizing that they can be more restrained. And I think if 10 years ago, if you went out and bought high-priced wines, in general, you were much more likely to find statistically big, heavy wines. Not all of them. These days, if you go out and buy high-priced wine, using this as a general, the sort of thing I'm talking about, you're more likely to find acidity and tannin and structure playing a more significant role in some of those bigger wines. And I sort of wonder whether the 10 and 11 vintages, maybe the gift of them, was bringing back an awareness of the beauty that can come from freshness, from acidity, from structure. And we mentioned aromatics, a different sort of aromatics that are inclusive of some of the herbal notes and the not just super ripe fruit. How they've evolved, I think the good 2011s have evolved maybe more and come into a spot where they're more easy to enjoy than they were even on release. And I think the good ones have shown the value of patience nicely.
Thank you, Mark. That's really is a little bit what I was hoping we were going to discuss. Is maybe with 2011 we've learned that it wasn't so bad to harvest fruit that was not so ripe. And maybe, as you said, today the question can be, in technical terms, summed up as where should we harvest in relationship to bricks, but also in relationship to color, and maybe when we have other factors that we can monitor to follow maturation, fine-tune a little bit how we position the window of harvest to maybe get some more vibrancy or some more freshness. That's why I was also hinting towards flavors, because we know that some flavors only appears towards a very long end of maturation that was hot. So maybe there is some more food for thoughts, and maybe, as you said, we haven't completely uncovered what we could learn from 2011 as far as shifting harvest date, maybe towards earlier date on a warm year and later date on a colder year. That's an interesting point that I think could have some technical consequences as far as what should we monitor in the plant and what should we monitor in the fruit, and what is actually from the climate driving this plant and fruit response. So at this point, if somebody in the audience wants to engage with our panelists, I'd like to invite for some questions. Yes, Steve?
The range that we've had in maturation and the limitations that we've had on harvesting, 2011, there was a lot of rain that came. A lot of people avoided it by picking perhaps earlier than they would have had they had no rain coming. In 2014, 15, certainly it was exceedingly high bricks that may have triggered harvest dates. But I guess to Dan and to the panel in general, what are the triggers that you look at through time from 2011 through today? And has that changed vintage by vintage? And what are you getting by responding to different harvest triggers?
You know, I've come to the realization that we make red wine with the skins primarily. So I really pay attention to the breakdown of the cell walls in the skin. I referred to berry sensory beforehand. So that's certainly a big aspect of it. Evolution of berry flavors and the diminution of the vegetal characters. And, you know, I think every bit of observation, one of the things I was thinking about is, as Thibaut referred to, looking at a vintage like 2017 and saying, you know, maybe I shouldn't disc, maybe I should mow, maybe I should leave the trunk suckers on. So I think the same thing holds true in the cellar. 2011 was probably not a year for cold soak, was not a year for indigenous fermentation if you thought you had some botrytis. So I think not being so religious about some of these techniques that we fall in love with and being more malleable. I think someone in the earlier panel talked about flexibility. I think that's becoming key.
I completely agree with that. And I think for harvest triggers, I tend to look at heat almost in the same way I look at rain events. And so I'll go out and look at and it's the intense observation that I think you talked about and some other people have talked about too. And just going out and really, you know, looking at your site. Does it drain well? Does it ventilate well? How much chlorosis? You know, what does the canopy look like? Or just really understanding what the site is. How is it going to go through this system that we're having? How close is it to being ripe? You know, is it almost there? And is it going to be too far? I don't like to pick during heat, and I don't like to pick during rain. So trying to see, really gauge how a specific site is going to respond to whatever's coming. And then obviously we've all seen the heat events that they say are going to be one day and they end up being 5. So going through your worst case scenario of, yeah, how many days of this can it handle, and knowing when to pull the plug. And then I love what was said earlier, because I'm already starting to think, you know, looking at 82 to 83, and we've got 16 to 17, and no, I don't think it's going to be as bad as 83, but we don't know. It's only January, and we're already pretty high for rainfall. So just thinking about what practices can I be talking to my vineyard management team about the other half of what we do. And do we want to do some checkerboarding with not disking every row? Do we want to keep permanent cover, delaying mowing, delaying shoot tucking? Just thinking about if there is a lot of moisture, because remember 11, how much moisture there was and how crazy the growth was. And if that, if you kept on the schedule and you weren't malleable, you were just going through and you'd do your first suckering pass and you'd go right back again, and you'd go through and do leafing, you'd go right back again. As soon as you finished any block system, you would be going right back. And I had vineyards where instead of doing that, we were waiting to tuck shoots, and we were waiting to thin, and we were waiting to tip, and just really taking our practices from the signals the vines gave us and thinking about what do they need, and how can I best, in 11 especially, we were so delayed. How can you get back to a timeline that gets you out of the risk of October rain, which is going to come? It's just a matter of when. So trying to get, it's such a play, because the later vintages are so nice, and I feel like every vintage is almost 2 vintages, because you look at the things, the vineyards that ripen early, and you're subject to the heat and just especially the intense heat. We've been having these heat spikes for the past couple of vintages that hit, and they're precipitating decisions that you would like to not be making at higher sugars than you would like to have. And then if you get through that hump of September, and there's the October vineyards, which are awesome because you can really pick your day, and you're not as subject to the crazy heat spikes. But I don't know where I was going with that. And anyways, just trying to get balance. And I think something else I'm thinking about this year is if there is a lot of moisture and we're looking at that, I think the timing and what you do is so important. Not only with the passes, but really dialing in the irrigation and thinking about what the vines need. Instead of being on this rote, we irrigate so many gallons every so many days, because you could just be extending your ripening season and again, delaying things further. So.
So another question I have for the four of you is, when you look at your experience tasting wines that are 5 years old, knowing the background of 2011, but were you able to pick up some sensorial traits in 2011, 5 years after, that you classically don't pick in wine bottles that have already aged 5 years? So it's a difficult question to ask, but I also wanted to take advantage of having Roger with us to see what could we expect to be different after 5 years of bottling in general.
Well, the most obvious factor, I suppose, is whether all of your anthocyanins have converted to polymeric pigment. And of those that would be hanging around, are they showing purple traits and co-pig, or are they red? Or are there no purple traits and no redness and it's red brick? And you can only tell that by looking at edges and white backgrounds and spectra. The question is, when does that kick in? And that kicks in when you've had more tannin than you had anthocyanin, so you ran out of anthocyanin. In years when you don't have that ratio, you could actually have had too little tannin and your anthocyanin can't be polymerized and you've got a residual. So the initial conditions will determine which outcome, but I think there's a lot of confusion where people think more anthocyanin means more polymeric pigment. That's only true if you've got excess tannin. If you don't, anthocyanin becomes limiting. Okay, so you've got to be careful. And I don't know the data from 2011 as to what would be typical, but I think if we went back and looked at them, we might be able to get an idea. So I look at the presence of purpleness as an indication of how preserved or slowly developing wine chemistry is. You go back to vintage ports. The classic of the vintage port is not getting oxidation rates, not getting polymerization like we see in red wine, and that purpleness can be retained for 10 or 20 years. But it's the free anthocyanin purpleness, which is what that marker is. So how quickly it becomes red brick, I think, is the fading of that development. But that's just the pigment tannin part of the story. There's a lot more to it than that.
Right.
If I could just make a quick comment to change topics. If you could put the slide up again with the rain, one of the things that's very interesting in 2011 is that last rain event. You see it, and it's back to Helen's point, and I think others would agree. What I was referring to is the year where couldn't get back into the vineyard, where you already had partial botrytis and now you had high botrytis pressure, primarily post-rain. It's the tail end. And maybe 20% or 30% of the vineyards were in that category. The others would have already been harvested. So that makes it really difficult to talk about a year when you're talking about almost a phase 1, phase 2. My focus isn't how great you can make your wine. My focus is how little bad wine you can make. So I tend to be, excuse the pun, bottom of the barrel kind of guy. You're all excellent. I'm a teacher. I'm interested in the people who are slipping behind. So I focus on the wines that didn't make it to the commercial production. And what do we do about those ones? Because those are often the differences in the business compared to talking about the glories of the good things. So does that make sense? I know I had a conversation earlier with somebody, but the two things I'd keep in mind is try to understand whether the wines you're talking about have been made with an excess of anthocyanin or they were made with an excess of tannin. One of the two, it's like bricks and the mortar in building the brick wall. Some people run out of bricks and have got leftover mortar. Some people ran out of mortar and they're left over with bricks. The only question is how big's the wall? But you better understand which one you're going to run out of, or you're probably not going to understand how big the wall will be.
Yeah.
The limiting one will be what determines what your wall is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then the last one, sugar accumulation is a good index up until 22.
Yeah.
After that, it's dehydration. So looking at the rate of a sugar curve to tell you how vines and stress are working in photosynthesis is good up to that point, but after that is irrelevant. And so, and yet many times we keep on integrating it and we keep on summing it up, and the answer is it doesn't matter, it stops. It's just dehydration. That's why sugar per berry will help you understand whether it made sugar or it didn't. Usually sugar can go up when berries dry out, and we think it got riper and it didn't, it just dehydrated. So even though it's a very erroneous number to multiply berry weight by bricks, or trying to get sugar per berry, it has a lot of error in it. It's probably often a better indicator of a trend pattern. Now the question is, where's the anthocyanin per berry? Where's the tannin per berry? And how do we understand berry size effects as we're looking at our accumulation curves?
Perfect. Mark, do you want to add something when you taste a 5-year-old wine? Maybe?
Well, I think the good wines that have aged well have harmonized. And I think 2011's, when they were fresh out of the, freshly released, were maybe because they didn't have the richness and flesh and fruit of some other vintages, they weren't as harmonious and integrated. And I think they relied more on the harmony that came from time. But I think the ones that are coming together well now are really showing that in a beautiful way. On the flip side, I think some wines had green notes, and some of those sort of pyrazine green notes that never age out. And some of those are still staying there and are maybe standing out a little bit more. But I think the ones that got it in the right window, as it were, those sort of herbal characters are now harmonizing with the natural aging characters of wine, and are tasting beautiful, and a different sort of aromatics than what we might see in riper vintages.
Right. Is there any question coming from you guys? Well, if you don't want to add anything, I think we can wrap it at this point. I don't see any question on the side. Also, thank you all for sharing your knowledge. Yeah.